Yeah, there's so many different jumping off points. You mentioned this sort of this corner of the internet,
yes,
which I think is probably a good way of sort of framing it. And lots of people have given it different names, sort of the liminal web or the sense-making web, or lots of different kind of. But the broadest frame, and I'd love to get your definitions on this as well, is what Jim Rutt has called the what's next space. Mm-hmm. This sort of sense of there's a lot of common themes. One is like the whole left by religion, like these sort of deeper questions of purpose and meaning that are not really addressed in modern society, and that sort of seems to be fueling a lot of the attention that many of the figures in this space have been getting, because they're wrestling with those deeper questions. And how would you frame like or delineate this kind of wider space or this wider conversation?
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I worry that there's a bias, because I do think the meaning crisis is a thing and it's important, and I do think it's kind of that whole, and we have different names for it, but I think we're talking often about very convergent things. I guess one of the things I would add to that is not only the matter, but the manner. One of the things that seems to typify this corner of the internet is that we're trying to move into what I call dialogos, what I talked about before, when, how Jonathan and I interact, and how it takes on a life of its own, because we're both seeking mutual movement and to afford each other insight and realization, and then that is in the service of right relationship, right? And that's a fundamentally different ethos than what you see through most of social media, a lot of the internet. So I think that manner, which I give the name to dialogos. I'm trying to pick up on many different things with that term. I think that is also an important thing. There's a commitment to that. And there's also a commitment to, and this is something I guess it's part of the manner. I think what we're also doing, and I'm trying to reuse a term that I got from Christianity. I don't think it's insulting to Christianity the way I'm using it. I think there's an attempt to rediscover and revalue fellowship as something distinct from specific friendship, or just being a member of a team or part of a corporation or whatever, right? And so because one of the things people often say, especially in more intense versions of like dialectic into dialogos, is they'll say, I didn't know that this kind of intimacy existed. It's neither sexual nor familiar nor friendship, but it's important, and I've always been craving it. They say that. And so I think another thing this corner of the internet is trying to do is to bring back into prominence the presence and the practice and the value of fellowship. So that's another thing that I don't see that as a value or even something that's being explored. And so for me, I use this metaphor of, we're trying to get the courtyard rather than the courtroom, where we're trying to get people who want to sit together and talk deeply and converse and participate in a conversation that takes on a life of its own. It's transformative, and they experience fellowship. Because of course, that is also something, the Dunbar number, people forget, right? 150, you're not friends with 150 people. I challenge you to be a good friend with 10 people, right? You can't do it. But they're not just people that are living with you, right? I would argue we evolved to be in fellowship. And I do think the ecclesia, the church, was a place that made that, I hope this is the right word, Jonathan, I think it made it sacred. There's something sacred about where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, right? Right? And so I think that that's another important aspect of this corner of the internet.
Yeah. And one of the things that it's been interestingly enough, it's also been moving out of the internet, which is something which is positive, and not interestingly too, not moving out in a singular way.
No.
Right? Because it could have been something like, some guru or whatever starts a thing, and then he has his group. So that's not what's happening. What's happening is you're seeing the estuary groups that Paul is doing.
Yes.
You have your groups of practices that you're kind of there. I can see that people the people are going back to church too, but not going back to different churches. People are going back into their churches and trying to and understanding the importance of ecclesia and the importance of fellowship, and then trying to create that at a local level too, because it can't completely exist only online.
No, and I agree. And I think one of the evidences of the reality of the rediscovery of fellowship and of dialogos is exactly what you're saying. If it just stayed on the internet, I would suspect its reality.
And that's where the practices come in as well.
Very much.
Sort of the circling or the authentic relating, and there is a sort of convergence that you're both pointing to of different practice groups that are maybe kind of becoming interested in a lot of these ideas, but have got maybe the embodied practices of fellowship or connection.
Yes.
And you mentioned Paul van der Klee as well, who, when I sort of described some of the workshops or practices that I was familiar with, he was like, oh yeah, that's small group in church. He was kind of basically saying, yeah, we've already got that. We don't need that. We've already got that.
And Paul's setting up of the estuary, like Jonathan said, I think that's really important. I mean,
what is the estuary? Just for...
an estuary is where salt water and fresh water mix.
Yeah.
And so the estuary isn't church, but it's a place that's supposed to be where people within the church and people without the church can meet in good faith dialogue. And really, where we're not going to we're not here, we're going to convert you, right? There's no secret agenda. And also, there's an expectation people coming in from the world. We're not in here to sort of, debunk your Christianity. But it's it's like, no, can we enter into genuine dialogos, and can we facilitate the formation of fellowship? And then how will that transform us? And then how can, people might go into the church, they might not. People might leave the church. That's also happened with estuary. But what happens is, how do people go back to where they go back home? And is what's happening in estuary going to transfer back and transfer their home life? And that's the important thing for estuary, as far as I understand it.
So these are people meeting online or meeting in person?
I think both.
Both.
Yeah.
Right.
But they do try to have in-person meetings as well.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Yeah. And I wanted to raise a criticism that came up because I completely agree with you about there is a form as well. It's not just the content, it is the form, and it's the way that these conversations are had. But I've spent a bit of time kind of dialing into what Peter Limberg and I have dubbed the critique sphere, which is sort of a group of people who've kind of emerged, and I think often have very valid criticisms of some of the figures in this space and some of the kind of focus on, and one of the criticisms they make is what they call civility porn. That a lot of the time, like this focus on kind of manners or the way that we interact actually can mask divisions, and sometimes kind of difficult conversations are not had, or that's one of the criticisms I think is worth raising.
I think they get the cart before the horse. I think if you want deep differences to be deeply discussed in a way that might be transformative, there has to be trust. And they're not getting, so they're putting the cart before the horse in the criticism. And it's like, and it is not that we lack debate in our society. And if that's the presupposition, that's a ridiculous presupposition. We are inundated, and everything has become adversarial. I am not saying we stop that. I think there are, but what I'm saying is, no, there are different needs being met in different ways, and we delegate it. If we're going to do, there's proper arenas for example, in science, I got to debate. That's part of the job. That's how you do it. That's how it works, right? But if I take that courtroom model into, try and take it into your relationship with your significant other, it's going to destroy it. And yeah, exactly. and if you get into that protest polka, like Susan Johnson talks about, and this is a therapeutic point, you actually can't get to the differences because people get caught up in the intensity of the conflict and mistake that for the issue that is potentially resolvable. And what you have to do is you have to break out of that. You have to return people to a deep kind of potential for trust. And then you say, now let's talk about our differences and avoid the protest polka, right? And let's try and can we both, let's say, can we bring up the differences, and then is it possible for there to be mutual movement? I think some people who criticize me just also forget the fact that I'm Canadian, and so that's just part of the culture. But for me, that would be my deepest reply. They're getting the cart before the horse, and they're presuming that there's a lack of adversarial debate in our culture, and I think that's not.
And I think that, and it's funny because if you pay attention to the conversations, you'll realize that some of the differences between us are huge.
They're deep.
They're big, and they're consequential if you follow them to what that means in terms of what types of solutions you'll apply. And so I think that and we are aware of them. We're not pretending, but we're saying there's no point. We actually do. It's like a circle. A circle is a good way to think about it. So we'll go into that subject a little, like we'll push it, we'll feel the tension, then we'll move on to something else, but then we know that in the next conversation we'll come back. Yeah. And so there'll be this circling where there's a mix of showing the person that you can trust them, and that it's like, this is not going to break our relationship, we trust each other, but then knowing, okay, this isn't over yet, we have to come back and we're going to discuss it. And so I think that I think that a lot of what I'm seeing in this like critique sphere is like what they would like to be able to put someone on trial and then just kind of put out all the accusations and what do you say to that, sir? What do you say to this? I mean, that's fine, whatever. That can exist, but I think that that's definitely not a model for a society, and it's not a model for showing how groups can exist. Because if we think about it that way, we're saying one of the things we have is a breakdown in the existence of these intermediary groups. Like we don't have communities anymore. Our families are broken. We don't have churches. We don't have intermediary organizations. We have the state, and then we have the individual, and everything else is being broken down in between. If we want to rebuild something like that, then we have to understand what it means. Because it's the same. If you live in a group and you would take on that critical approach, someone that lives in the same house as you, how long do you think you're going to be living with them? Yes. It doesn't mean that you have to ignore it, but you have to come at it like this, like the cycling of trust and of questioning. That's the only way to do it. And it's, in a relationship with one person, it's the same thing. You can't always be telling the person their faults. And those faults could be completely true. Like everything I say about my wife, if I criticize her, could be absolutely true. But if that's all I do, because you haven't fixed that yet, right? Because I see you haven't fixed it, so let's keep talking about it until you fix it. It's like, that's not a reality.
It's also a pretentious standing point for the critic, right? So, right? I'm out here and I'm going to do this and I'm going to find the criticisms, but where are you standing are you going to come in and actually, one of two things will happen. Then you'll allow me to do that to you, and then we'll get to the point of non-negotiable faults that we won't, right? And that's what happens when relationships break down. Or we'll get into, I'm going to actually open up a little towards you, and then you're going to move towards, I would argue, if you're going to actually participate, as opposed to taking a pretentious epistemic stance, then you're going to either move into acrimonious division, or you're going to have to move into something
But sometimes acrimonious division is necessary, right? It's absolutely necessary. Sometimes you do have to eject someone from a group because their behavior or the things they're saying are completely corrosive to the existence of something. Yeah. So I'm not saying that shouldn't exist, but we should be careful to think that this is just the manner that which you deal with problems or questions, that we're not, that in our relationships we're not addressing these issues. We're doing it progressively through these cycles of discussion. So that's what I think.
So here's what I totally agree with that. And what I would say is we have enough forces, both algorithmic and social, pushing into prominence acrimonious division, right? That it doesn't need to be emphasized. It can be needed or necessary. I think we've got an imbalance. So if they think it's civility porn, I think it's trying to address a significant imbalance in the society.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something I've thought a lot about, having tracked a lot of these public conversations, one of which was the idea of the kind of intellectual dark web. Can we have sort of conversations that go beyond ideology, that are kind of going somewhere new? And it's very difficult when there's a sort of level of prominence, partly, as you say, because of the tools, because of the algorithms, which on both sides sort of, they boost conflict, they boost tribalism, they boost criticism, but they also identify us often with our worst takes, or we sort of calcify around our worst opinions in a way, a lot of the time, because we sort of are forced to defend them. And I also think there was as you mentioned, like the sense of safety that's needed to create for these conversations, I think was not created or was not able to be expanded beyond the sort of a small number of people. And like what I think is quite beneficial about the conversation that we're part of is it's hopefully happened a little bit more underground, longer to be able to build up some of those relationships of trust, not in this kind of like New York Times article about all of these new public intellectuals, which then kind of creates this obvious kind of target. And quite rightly, I mean, it should have been a target, but then often you saw that a lot of those relationships break down, a lot of the kind of safety of the conversation break down for various human reasons, magnified by the social media kind of platforms that we're using, which bring out the worst in us and augment lack of trust as well.
And I think a lot of it is because it happened explicitly on the political level, and the political level, that's what that level is for. It does have a certain amount of debate, a certain amount of it's the level of conflict. That's where the political level. That's where we have wars.
That's also where we get the attention as well. So it drags people there because there's such a temptation. Because that's where you get the responses on Twitter. That's where you get the. So in a way, it's a strange attractor of immense force.
The discussion we've been having, they have political corollaries, but they don't tend to be focused on politics. We don't tend to deal with the recent issue and everything. So we're trying to kind of talk about the meaning crisis more and about how we can kind of solve that. And then sometimes we'll say a little bit of politics, but it's not the central thing. And I think that's helped. I think that in the IDW, one of the things that happened, and you can see what it broke down, was it ended up being the political sphere and like specific political questions that this person is on the wrong side of, or on the right side of, and then I can't associate with them anymore, and so then we criticize each other across, and so.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think first the attempt to shift the sacred into the political arena has been a significant mistake. I have criticisms that politics takes largely at the level of propositions, and it can't incorporate a lot of the other stuff that I think is central to meaning making. And I do worry also, like I said, I've said to you before, I worry about the hermeneutics of suspicion being considered the default mode in which we approach reality, and the hermeneutics of suspicion prioritizes devastating criticism, right? So the devastating criticism that knocks the person down or reveals the secret flaw, and we aha, and it's like, okay, you do need to do that because there are people that should be knocked off their high horse. I'm not saying that. But again, why not also present what the hermeneutics of suspicion always depends on, which is the hermeneutics of beauty, right?